The main dining room of the Crystal Chandelier in Beverly Hills glowed under the brilliant illumination of three massive crystal fixtures, suspended from the vaulted ceiling. It was the most exclusive establishment in California, where a simple dinner could easily cost the equivalent of a month of groceries for a modest family. The tables were draped in imported linens, the tableware was crafted from fine porcelain, and every glass of wine poured was worth more than the daily wage of the people serving it. Chloe Davis navigated between the tightly packed tables, her heavy silver tray perfectly balanced on her right hand. She had worked at the Crystal Chandelier for nearly 2 years, and although her feet throbbed in absolute agony after every 12-hour shift, she never uttered a single complaint because she simply could not afford such a luxury. At home in East Los Angeles, her mother Evelyn waited for her heart growing weaker by the day, alongside a mountain of medical bills that piled up without any mercy. On this particular evening, the restaurant was exceptionally crowded, with a major celebration taking over the center of the main room for the wedding anniversary of Lawrence Brooks, one of the most powerful real estate tycoons in the region. He had reserved the prime space to honor his wife, Rachel Brooks, a woman whose terrifying reputation always preceded her like a dark, suffocating shadow. Chloe had heard countless horror stories about Rachel. It was widely whispered that she enjoyed making waitresses cry, that she took immense pleasure in humiliating anyone she considered beneath her, and that her tongue was sharper than any chef's knife. "Chloe, main table right now," said Matthew Foster, the floor manager, his face pale and his voice trembling with a highly visible nervous energy. "And please, ensure that absolutely everything is flawless. I cannot afford a single problem with Mrs. Brooks tonight." Chloe nodded respectfully, took a deep breath to steady her racing heart, and walked toward the central table where Rachel held court exactly like a demanding queen. Beside her, Lawrence Brooks chatted amiably with a few wealthy guests, seemingly oblivious to the incredibly tense aura his wife generated all around her. Rachel was a woman who demanded submission. Her diamond jewelry sparkled almost as fiercely as the ceiling fixtures, and her cold eyes scanned the elegant room with a look that managed to evaluate and despise everything simultaneously. When Rachel finally noticed Chloe approaching, her heavily painted lips curled into something that completely failed to resemble a genuine smile. "Finally," Rachel announced in a piercing voice that seemed to slice through the ambient noise of the room, "we have been waiting here for centuries. Or do you simply not care that we have highly important guests to entertain?" Chloe maintained a strictly professional tone as she carefully placed the delicate plates on the table, offering a polite apology for the slight delay and explaining that the dining room was fully booked for the evening. "Your best effort?" Rachel let out a loud, mocking laugh that caused several guests to shift uncomfortably in their expensive seats. "If this is your absolute best, I shudder to imagine what your worst looks like." It was in the exact moment Chloe leaned forward to serve Executive Chef Ryan's signature soup that the disaster struck. Rachel made a sudden, wildly dramatic gesture with her arm during her conversation, striking the heavy silver spoon resting beside her plate and launching it directly into the air. The spoon crashed onto the pristine marble floor with a loud metallic ringing sound that echoed through the sudden, suffocating silence of the entire restaurant. Chloe instinctively bent down to retrieve the dropped silverware, but before her fingers could even brush the cold metal, Rachel raised a perfectly manicured hand and ordered her to freeze. Without a single ounce of remorse, Rachel picked up a second spoon, held it up to the light theatrically, and deliberately dropped it onto the floor right next to the first one. "Oops," Rachel said with a chilling, malicious grin, fully leaning back into her plush chair and crossing her arms. "I want you to pick those up, but I want you to do it correctly. Get on your knees." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room, but nobody dared to intervene, not even Matthew, who merely stood nearby sweating in absolute panic. Chloe thought of her sick mother, the expensive medication she needed to survive, and the towering pile of past-due hospital bills waiting on their kitchen counter. She slowly began to bend her knees, ready to surrender her pride just to end the waking nightmare and keep her desperately needed paycheck. Suddenly, Chloe stopped halfway down, remembering Evelyn's gentle voice, telling her years ago that true dignity is the one thing nobody can ever take from you unless you willingly hand it over. Chloe stood up straight, her face entirely serene, and placed her serving tray firmly onto the nearest empty table, with a resounding thud. Looking directly into the eyes of the stunned billionaire, Chloe declared that she had served hundreds of difficult people, but nobody had ever asked her to forfeit her basic human dignity. She calmly unfastened her apron, folded it neatly on the table, announced her immediate resignation, and walked out the front doors, as Arthur Fletcher, an elderly gentleman sitting quietly in the corner, smiled knowingly at the incredible scene. The freezing night air of Los Angeles hit Chloe's flushed face like a harsh slap of reality, as the heavy glass doors of the crystal chandelier sealed shut behind her. She managed to take a dozen steps down the illuminated sidewalk before her trembling legs finally gave out, forcing her to collapse onto a nearby concrete bench. The surging adrenaline that had kept her spine straight and her voice completely steady during her confrontation with Rachel Brooks was rapidly fading, leaving behind a crushing, paralyzing wave of pure terror. Pulling her phone from her pocket with shaking fingers, she stared at the glowing screen that displayed a scheduled reminder to purchase her mother's vital heart medication the very next morning. The medication alone cost almost half of her monthly wages that completely ceased to exist the moment she dropped her apron onto the table and walked away from her livelihood. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not out of any regret for defending her self-worth against a tyrant, but out of a deep, suffocating panic regarding how she would possibly explain this disaster to her mother. Her phone buzzed frantically with a barrage of text messages from her close friend and co-worker, Daisy Miller, who had witnessed the entire humiliating ordeal from the kitchen doors. Daisy frantically typed that Rachel was throwing a massive tantrum, screaming at management, and making angry phone calls to ensure Chloe would be permanently blacklisted from every single restaurant in the entire state of California. The bus ride back to her neighborhood took exactly 40 minutes, though to Chloe, trapped in a spiraling vortex of dark thoughts, it felt like several agonizing hours of torture. She stared blankly out the scratched window, seeing nothing but Rachel's cruel, victorious smile, and hearing the deafening silence of the wealthy bystanders who had chosen to look away rather than help her. When she finally stepped off the bus, the familiar sense of damp pavement and street food welcomed her back to a reality, completely detached from the glittering wealth of Beverly Hills. The porch light of her small, aging house was still illuminated, signaling that Evelyn was awake, waiting up for her daughter exactly as she did every single night without fail. Chloe paused at the front door, her hand hovering over the worn brass knob, entirely unable to bring herself to turn it and shatter her mother's fragile sense of security. Evelyn opened the door before Chloe could make a decision, her deeply lined face breaking into a tired but incredibly warm smile that smelled of cinnamon and brewing herbal tea. Instantly noticing Chloe's severely bloodshot eyes and trembling posture, Evelyn refused to accept the excuse of the cold wind and gently guided her daughter into the worn but cozy living room. Unable to hold the heavy burden a moment longer, Chloe completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as she recounted every terrible detail of the dropped spoons, the cruel demands, and her impulsive resignation. Instead of the harsh reprimand or devastating disappointment Chloe fully expected to receive, she felt two warm, frail hands gently cup her wet face and lift her gaze upward. Evelyn had tears pooling in her own eyes, but they were tears of immense, overflowing pride rather than sorrow or fear about their impending financial ruin. She softly told Chloe that she had lived many years and seen many things, learning that people with all the money in the world are often completely empty inside, while those with nothing can be incredibly rich in spirit. Evelyn declared that choosing to stand up instead of kneeling before cruelty was the greatest victory possible, assuring her terrified daughter that the universe would somehow provide for them just as it always had. That night, Chloe lay wide awake in her small bedroom, listening to the distant barking of a stray dog, while her anxious mind frantically calculated their impossible expenses. Rent, electricity, water, groceries, and medicine formed an insurmountable mountain of debt that simply could not be paid without her steady income from the luxury restaurant. Meanwhile, miles away in the opulent dining room of the Crystal Chandelier, Rachel Brooks was completely ruining the remainder of her anniversary dinner by loudly threatening to destroy the insolent waitress. She dialed powerful contacts, demanding that Chloe Davis never wash another dish or pour another glass of water in any establishment that valued their wealthy clientele. Sitting unnoticed in the corner shadow of the dining room, Arthur Fletcher observed Rachel's vindictive rampage without uttering a single word or touching his expensive meal. He was a man whose deeply lined face held decades of buried secrets, and he knew something about the brave waitress that would completely shatter Rachel's arrogant world. Arthur quietly stood up, left a stack of $100 bills on the table, and intercepted the panicked manager by the coat check to ask for the brave girl's full name. Upon hearing the name Evelyn Davis, Arthur's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He handed the manager his minimalist business card and walked into the night, knowing the wheels of a long-delayed justice had finally begun to turn. The following 2 weeks were undeniably the most grueling and humiliating days Chloe had ever endured in her entire life. Just as she had deeply feared, the invisible but incredibly powerful doors of the hospitality industry began slamming shut in her face, one after another, leaving her completely out in the cold. Every upscale cafe, boutique hotel, and modest diner, where she dropped off her carefully printed resume, offered her the exact same rehearsed, awkward apologies and nervous glances. The true extent of Rachel Brooks's terrifying influence was fully confirmed when Chloe visited a modest bistro run by Felix Duncan, a kind-hearted man she had worked for several years prior. Felix pulled her into his small back office, lowering his voice to an absolute whisper as he confessed that he desperately wanted to hire her, but simply could not take the massive risk. He explained that a very powerful representative had explicitly threatened to permanently cut off his premium food suppliers and blacklist his bistro if Chloe was ever seen working on his premises. Defeated, Chloe wandered the sunlit streets of the city, feeling completely invisible and entirely devoid of any hope for her rapidly crumbling future. Her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Daisy, demanding they meet immediately at the small public park, located just 3 blocks away from the Crystal Chandelier. Sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shade of a massive oak tree, Daisy anxiously checked her surroundings before pulling a pristine, heavy-stock business card from her leather purse. She explained that the mysterious, wealthy regular from the restaurant had aggressively insisted that Matthew, the manager, pass this card along to Chloe, stressing that it was a matter of utmost importance. Daisy revealed the most unsettling detail of all. The wealthy stranger had specifically asked about Chloe's mother, knowing Evelyn's name before anyone had even mentioned it. Chloe stared at the simple black text reading Arthur Fletcher, her racing heart caught between a deeply ingrained sense of caution and a desperate, burning curiosity about the stranger. That evening, after carefully serving Evelyn a modest dinner and ensuring she took her rapidly dwindling supply of heart medication, Chloe sat alone in their tiny, overgrown backyard. The city stars were barely visible through the thick Los Angeles smog, mirroring the heavy, suffocating fog that currently clouded her entire existence and future prospects. When Evelyn stepped onto the back porch, wrapped in her faded robe, Chloe decided to drop the heavy burden of secrecy and handed her mother the pristine business card. She fully expected her mother to be slightly confused, but she was entirely unprepared for Evelyn's face to drain of all color as she dramatically clutched her chest in sheer terror. Chloe leaped out of her chair, terrified that her mother was suffering a massive cardiac event. But Evelyn simply sank into a rusted patio chair, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the printed name. Evelyn whispered the name Arthur Fletcher into the dark night, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and a terrifying ancient fear that Chloe had never witnessed before. When pressed for answers, Evelyn tightly shut her eyes and softly admitted that she had known a man by that exact name many decades ago, long before Chloe was even a thought in this world. Before Chloe could demand the full truth, Evelyn suffered a violent coughing fit that immediately ended the conversation, leaving the massive, heavy secret securely locked away for the night. Alone in her bedroom, and driven by a desperate need for absolute clarity, Chloe punched the 10 digits into her phone, listening to the agonizing rings before a deep, calm voice finally answered. She introduced herself, and Arthur's voice immediately softened with a heavy, unmistakable emotional weight, thanking her profoundly for taking the massive risk of calling him. He firmly refused to explain the details over the insecure phone line, insisting that the incredibly complex history of her family and the vast injustices committed against them required a face-to-face meeting. He instructed her to meet him exactly at noon the following day, at a quiet, completely unassuming coffee shop called the Little Corner Cafe, warning her to tell absolutely no one about their secret arrangement. Chloe spent another agonizing, entirely sleepless night staring at the cracked paint on her ceiling, her exhausted mind spinning wild theories about her absent father and this mysterious billionaire. She vividly recalled the decades of brutal, back-breaking sacrifices her mother had made, cleaning the massive homes of wealthy strangers just to keep food on their modest table. The terrifying thought that their crushing poverty was not a random stroke of horrible luck, but rather a deliberately engineered punishment, made her blood boil with a fierce, righteous anger. She finally understood that tomorrow's meeting would not just provide answers, it was going to completely obliterate the fragile reality she had known her entire life. The Little Corner Cafe was a small, incredibly quiet establishment that smelled heavenly of roasted beans and warm pastries, providing the perfect anonymous setting for their highly sensitive meeting. Chloe arrived a full 10 minutes early, strategically choosing a secluded booth near the back exit, just in case her deeply ingrained survival instincts demanded a rapid escape from the situation. Arthur Fletcher walked through the door, precisely at noon, moving with a slow, highly dignified grace that commanded immediate respect from everyone in the small room. As he slid into the booth across from her, Chloe felt a bizarre, totally inexplicable sense of profound familiarity, as if she were looking into the eyes of a beloved relative she had somehow forgotten. Arthur ordered 2 black coffees from the cheerful waitress, patiently waiting until they were entirely alone, before taking a deep, fortifying breath to begin his incredible tale. He asked Chloe what she knew about her father, and she bitterly replied that he was a coward who had abandoned them when she was a defenseless infant, leaving her mother to shoulder the massive burden alone. Arthur slowly shook his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and gently corrected her by stating that her father was the bravest man he had ever known, and his name was Isaac Fletcher. He explained that the Fletchers were a family of unfathomable wealth, controlling vast real estate empires, and his younger brother Isaac was the wild, romantic dreamer of the rigid family. Arthur's voice trembled slightly as he described how Isaac fell deeply and permanently in love with a beautiful, kind-hearted maid who worked tirelessly in their massive summer estate. Their tyrannical father, Richard Fletcher, discovered the secret romance and delivered a brutal ultimatum: abandon the impoverished girl immediately, or be stripped of the family name and absolutely every cent of the massive inheritance. Without a single moment of hesitation, Isaac chose love, legally changing his last name to Davis, marrying his soulmate in absolute secrecy, and vanishing completely from the wealthy society that sought to control him. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his expensive tailored suit and placed a severely faded, deeply creased photograph directly onto the scratched wooden table between them. Chloe picked up the photograph with violently shaking hands, her breath catching entirely in her throat as she recognized the incredibly young, radiant face of her own mother standing next to a handsome man. The man had Chloe's exact eyes, her stubborn jawline, and a smile so full of absolute, pure joy that it made Chloe's heart ache with a profound, terrifying grief she didn't fully understand. Arthur softly revealed the most devastating truth of all. Isaac Davis had never abandoned his beloved family. He was tragically killed in a highly suspicious construction accident when Chloe was only 3 months old. The realization hit Chloe like a massive freight train. completely destroying her lifelong belief that she was unwanted, replacing the deep bitterness with a sudden, overwhelming surge of agonizing sorrow. Tears flowed freely down Chloe's face as Arthur reached across the table, gently taking her trembling hands in his own warm, incredibly steady grip. He explained that he had spent the last 20 years desperately searching for them, secretly defying his cruel family to find the niece he knew was out there struggling in the dark. He firmly stated that Chloe was a true Fletcher by blood, the absolute rightful heir to a massive portion of an empire that had been maliciously stolen from her grieving mother. Arthur promised that the terrifying days of struggling to afford basic medication and enduring the cruel humiliation of entitled billionaires were finally coming to a permanent, dramatic end. The conversation inevitably shifted to Rachel Brooks, and Arthur's expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated resolve as he explained the deeply intertwined financial history. He revealed that Rachel's luxurious, arrogant lifestyle was completely funded by a massive multi-million-dollar loan from the Fletcher estate to Lawrence Brooks, a massive debt that was mysteriously forgiven after Isaac's tragic death. The sheer, sickening irony that Rachel had demanded the true heiress of the fortune that funded her diamonds get on her knees to pick up a dropped spoon made Chloe's blood run completely cold. Arthur declared that Rachel believed she possessed ultimate power, but she was entirely unaware that the poor waitress she tried to destroy held the absolute legal right to dismantle her entire fraudulent empire. Chloe looked at this elderly man, a complete stranger who shared her blood and her father's eyes, and felt an immense, blazing fire ignite deep within her soul. She was no longer just a struggling, exhausted waitress, terrified of missing a rent payment. She was the daughter of a man who chose true love over billions of dollars. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, her posture straightening as she looked Arthur directly in the eyes, and firmly agreed to fight for the justice her father deserved. The quiet cafe seemed to fade away completely, as uncle and niece forged an unbreakable alliance, preparing to unleash an unprecedented storm upon the arrogant elites of Beverly Hills. Chloe practically ran the entire distance from the bus stop to her modest home, her mind completely consumed by the massive, life-altering revelations she had just absorbed at the cafe. She burst through the front door, finding Evelyn sitting completely still in the faded armchair, staring blankly out the window as if she had aged a full decade overnight. Chloe dropped to her knees in front of her mother, gently taking Evelyn's cold hands and softly demanding the entire truth about Isaac Fletcher, the construction accident, and the decades of heavy silence. Evelyn finally turned her gaze to her daughter, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of profound relief as she realized the exhausting charade was finally, permanently over. Rising slowly from her chair, Evelyn walked to the back of her cramped bedroom closet and pulled out an incredibly dusty, beautifully carved wooden box that had remained hidden for over 20 years. She placed it carefully on the kitchen table and opened the brass latch, revealing a tragic treasure trove of faded letters, old photographs, and a heavy gold ring intricately engraved with the initials "If." Evelyn wept openly as she recounted the sheer perfection of their hidden romance, describing how Isaac looked at her not as a servant, but as the absolute center of his entire universe. She explained that despite losing immense mansions and limitless bank accounts, Isaac claimed he was the wealthiest man on earth the day they moved into a tiny, drafty apartment together. The story took a terrifyingly dark turn, as Evelyn described the weeks leading up to the tragic incident that shattered their perfect, quiet existence forever. Isaac had come home deeply panicked, one rainy evening, claiming he had spotted a man who exclusively handled his ruthless father's most secretive, highly illegal problems lurking near his construction site. 3 days later, the supposedly secure scaffolding Isaac was standing on completely collapsed, instantly killing him and leaving Evelyn entirely alone with a newborn baby. Barely a week after the funeral, aggressive corporate lawyers appeared at Evelyn's door, offering her a staggering sum of cash in exchange for her absolute, permanent silence and a legally binding agreement to vanish. Evelyn's eyes burned with an ancient, fierce maternal fire as she explained that she vehemently refused their filthy blood money, opting instead to hide in extreme poverty just to keep Chloe completely safe. She believed that if the Fletchers knew about the child, they would either rip the baby away using their vast legal resources or ensure Chloe met a tragic end, just like her brave father. Chloe sobbed, pulling her mother into a desperate, crushing embrace, finally understanding that every single day of back-breaking labor Evelyn endured was a profound act of absolute, unconditional love. But Evelyn pulled back, wiping her tears, and stated that after witnessing Chloe boldly stand up to Rachel Brooks, she knew her daughter possessed the fierce Fletcher spirit and could no longer remain hidden. Reaching into the very bottom of the wooden box, Evelyn produced a remarkably well-preserved legal document, its heavy parchment paper folded meticulously into a protective leather envelope. She explained that Isaac, completely terrified of his family's boundless cruelty, had secretly drafted a legally binding will just a few short weeks before his untimely death. Chloe carefully unfolded the document and read the words aloud. Isaac explicitly left every single asset, trust fund, and birthright he possessed exclusively to his beloved daughter, Chloe. This singular piece of paper, officially notarized and completely ironclad, was the ultimate weapon, capable of entirely bypassing the corrupt Fletcher family trust and legally reclaiming her stolen destiny. Chloe immediately dialed Arthur's private number, her voice shaking with adrenaline, as she informed him about the perfectly preserved will and the undeniable proof of her legal inheritance. Arthur was rendered completely speechless for a long moment before letting out a joyous, triumphant laugh, declaring that this document was the exact missing piece they desperately needed to launch a full-scale legal war. He instructed Chloe to prepare herself for a massive, brutal fight, promising to instantly dispatch Madeline Cross, the most feared and respected inheritance litigator in the entire state of California. Arthur assured them that with Madeline leading the charge, they were going to systematically dismantle the corrupt empires built on Isaac's grave and completely financially ruin those responsible. That evening, as the Los Angeles sun dipped below the smoggy horizon, the small, neglected house felt entirely different, transformed from a prison of poverty into a powerful fortress of truth. Chloe and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table late into the night, carefully organizing the letters, the photographs, and the legal will into pristine folders for the upcoming legal battles. Chloe knew that Rachel Brooks was currently sitting in her massive mansion, completely confident in her terrifying power to crush a helpless waitress into absolute submission. But Rachel was entirely oblivious to the fact that the very waitress she sought to destroy was rapidly arming herself with the ultimate legal firepower to completely obliterate her privileged, stolen life. The ensuing weeks transformed Chloe's life into a highly secretive, intense whirlwind of endless legal briefings, strategic meetings, and shocking discoveries orchestrated by Madeline Cross and her elite team. Madeline, a fiercely intelligent woman with an incredibly sharp gaze, authenticated Isaac's will within 48 hours, confirming it gave Chloe absolute legal standing to sue the Fletcher estate for hundreds of millions. However, tracking the massive, illicit loan that built Lawrence Brooks's vast hotel empire required digging through decades of heavily redacted, highly classified financial records that were deeply buried by expensive accountants. While the elite lawyers worked tirelessly in the shadows, Chloe continued to struggle with her daily reality, stubbornly refusing Arthur's generous offers of cash because she wanted to win with her pride completely intact. The massive breakthrough they desperately needed arrived unexpectedly when Daisy called Chloe in an absolute panic, demanding an immediate meeting at a secluded coffee shop across town. Daisy arrived accompanied by a deeply nervous, heavily perspiring older man named George Lewis, who tightly clutched a battered leather briefcase to his chest as if his life depended on it. George introduced himself as a senior forensic accountant who had worked directly for Lawrence Brooks for over 30 years, bearing witness to decades of incredibly dark, highly illegal financial manipulations. Driven entirely by a crippling, lifelong guilt and inspired by the wild rumors of Chloe's brave defiance at the restaurant, George had decided to finally cross the line and risk his own freedom. Opening the battered briefcase, George slid a thick stack of highly confidential bank transfers, private contracts, and secret ledgers directly across the table to a stunned Chloe. He explained that Clara Fletcher, Chloe's incredibly cruel grandmother, had maliciously seized absolute control of the family finances, immediately following her husband's death and Isaac's highly suspicious murder. The documents proved unequivocally that Clara had illegally forgiven the massive, empire-building debt owed by Lawrence Brooks in exchange for a massive, completely untraceable personal payoff deposited into a secret offshore account. This deeply corrupt transaction effectively stole millions of dollars directly from Isaac's rightful estate, completely funding Rachel's luxurious life, with money that legally and morally belonged to Chloe. George lowered his voice to a terrified whisper, revealing that Lawrence Brooks and Clara Fletcher had maintained a deeply toxic, blackmail-driven relationship for decades to keep the theft completely hidden. The most explosive piece of leverage, George noted, was that Rachel Brooks was entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband's entire empire was essentially built on a foundation of massive fraud and extortion. Chloe rushed these explosive documents directly to Arthur's heavily guarded estate that very evening, watching as the elderly man's face twisted in profound disgust at his own mother's breathtaking level of calculated evil. Arthur realized they now possessed the exact ammunition required to completely destroy the Brooks empire and legally force a massive settlement. But a new, highly dangerous threat emerged almost immediately. Madeline Cross called Arthur's secure line with incredibly grim news. A highly paid informant had leaked their investigation to Rachel Brooks's massive, ruthless legal team. Rachel's aggressive lawyers immediately fired off a terrifying warning shot, officially threatening to bury Chloe in a massive million-dollar defamation lawsuit that would completely bankrupt her and drag her sick mother into court. They falsely claimed to possess dozens of heavily bribed witnesses ready to testify under oath that Chloe had violently attacked Rachel at the restaurant in a desperate, premeditated extortion plot. Arthur gently offered Chloe a chance to walk away and protect her mother from the incredibly vicious public smear campaign, but Chloe's eyes hardened with an absolute, unyielding resolve. Chloe vehemently refused to back down, declaring that if the incredibly arrogant elites wanted a brutal war, she was going to bring the fight directly to their front door on her own terms. She devised a highly dangerous, incredibly bold plan to bypass the massive armies of expensive lawyers and strike directly at the weakest, most vulnerable link in the entire corrupt chain, Lawrence Brooks. Knowing Lawrence dined completely alone at the Crystal Chandelier every single Tuesday evening while Rachel attended a charity board meeting, Chloe planned to infiltrate the heavily guarded restaurant with Daisy's help. She intended to confront the billionaire completely alone, armed with the undeniable proof of his massive financial crimes, and force him to publicly confess the absolute truth before Rachel could destroy her. On Tuesday evening, the sky above Beverly Hills opened up, unleashing a massive torrential downpour, as Daisy successfully smuggled Chloe through the busy service entrance of the exclusive restaurant. Chloe smoothed her modest dress, took a deep, stabilizing breath, and confidently walked directly into the opulent main dining room, ignoring the shocked gasps of the waitstaff who recognized her. She marched straight to the secluded corner table, where Lawrence Brooks sat nursing an expensive glass of wine, dropping the faded photograph of her father directly onto his pristine linen tablecloth. Lawrence looked down at the photograph of his former best friend, all the color instantly draining from his aged face as he looked up into the fiercely determined, incredibly familiar eyes of Isaac's daughter. Before Lawrence could even attempt to formulate a coherent response to the terrifying ghost sitting across from him, the sharp, incredibly distinct sound of high heels echoed aggressively across the marble floor. Rachel Brooks stormed into the dining room, having been tipped off by a loyal waiter, her face contorted into a mask of absolute, unhinged fury as she recognized the waitress she despised. She viciously demanded to know why her wealthy husband was secretly conversing with the pathetic, lying extortionist who had publicly humiliated her, completely oblivious to the massive financial bomb about to detonate. Chloe calmly stood her ground, looking directly into Rachel's furious eyes, and coldly suggested that Rachel ask her terrified husband about Clara Fletcher, the stolen millions, and the blood money funding her diamonds. Chloe turned her back on the screaming billionaire and walked out of the restaurant into the freezing, torrential rain, her heart pounding with a fierce, incredible sense of ultimate victory. She hailed a cab directly to Arthur's massive estate, where she was immediately ushered into the warm, incredibly opulent library to find Arthur sitting alongside an incredibly frail, weeping older man. Arthur introduced the crying man as Franklin, the deeply loyal, lifelong chauffeur of the Fletcher family, who had finally found the courage to unburden his incredibly heavy, deeply tortured conscience. Franklin completely broke down as he confessed that he had personally driven the hired thug who deliberately sabotaged the construction scaffolding on the explicit, deeply evil orders of Clara Fletcher. Within an hour, a completely soaked, visibly broken Lawrence Brooks arrived at the estate, having been completely abandoned by a hysterical Rachel after finally confessing the entire, horrifying financial truth. Lawrence handed Arthur a heavily sealed, incredibly old envelope that he had kept hidden in a secure vault for decades, entirely too terrified of Clara's wrath to ever open it. The envelope contained a comprehensive, highly detailed report from a private investigator Lawrence had secretly hired years ago, proving definitively that Clara had orchestrated the murder and the massive financial cover-up. Lawrence looked Chloe directly in the eyes, weeping openly as he formally pledged to publicly testify against the estate, surrender his corrupt empire, and return every single stolen cent to Isaac's rightful heir. The ensuing legal explosion completely captivated the entire nation as elite investigative journalists published the incredible, highly romantic, and deeply tragic story of Isaac and Evelyn's forbidden love. The massive public pressure and the absolute mountain of undeniable evidence forced the corrupt Fletcher Trust to completely collapse, resulting in a staggering, multi-million-dollar settlement officially awarded directly to Chloe. The very first thing Chloe did with her massive new fortune was secure the absolute best, most expensive cardiovascular specialists in the entire world, ensuring Evelyn made a complete, miraculous recovery. Rachel Brooks, completely stripped of her stolen wealth and her highly prized social status, was viciously exiled by the exact same elite society that had previously enabled her horrific cruelty. Chloe utilized a massive portion of her reclaimed inheritance to establish the Isaac Fletcher Foundation, a massive philanthropic organization dedicated to providing full educational scholarships to deeply impoverished, hard-working youth. She hired Daisy away from the incredibly toxic restaurant industry, appointing her as the executive director of the foundation, ensuring the massive funds were managed with absolute, uncompromising integrity and deep compassion. George Lewis, the brave accountant who risked everything, was provided with elite legal protection and a highly lucrative position managing the foundation's massive endowment, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in decades. Arthur spent his final years surrounded by the incredible warmth of the family he had desperately sought, constantly reminding Chloe just how incredibly proud her brave father would be of her relentless fight. Exactly 1 year after the horrific incident with the dropped spoons, Chloe returned to the incredibly opulent dining room of the newly renovated and completely renamed restaurant, Isaac's House. She was not there balancing heavy silver trays or wearing a starched apron. She was sitting at the absolute best table in the center of the room as the deeply respected, highly honored owner. Surrounded by Evelyn, Arthur, Daisy, and a deeply humbled Lawrence, Chloe stood up, raising a crystal glass of incredibly expensive champagne as the entire, completely packed dining room fell into an absolute, respectful silence. She spoke softly but incredibly clearly, dedicating the beautiful evening to a brave man who chose true love over billions, and to a fiercely strong mother who chose brutal sacrifice over easy submission. True power does not reside in the thickness of a wallet or the height of a social pedestal, but rather in the quiet resilience of a pure heart. We often encounter individuals who use their status as a weapon, seeking to diminish others to mask their own profound insecurities. Yet, the most enduring strength belongs to those who refuse to surrender their dignity, even when the weight of the world demands they kneel. Life's greatest trials test not our bank accounts but our character, proving that genuine respect cannot be bought. It must be earned through empathy and unwavering grace. When we stand tall against arrogance, we honor not only ourselves but the sacrifices of those who loved us enough to teach us our true worth. In the end, the darkest secrets are always dragged into the illuminating light of truth, and justice, though sometimes agonizingly delayed, is ultimately served by the brave. Material wealth can vanish in a single breath, but a legacy built on courageous love, profound integrity, and absolute self-respect will echo through generations, lighting the way for those who dare to stand their ground.